What you're about to witness defied every rule of war, shattered the boundaries between enemies, and left an entire hospital in tears. August 1945. The war had just ended. In a makeshift field hospital on the outskirts of devastated Hiroshima, a group of exhausted Japanese nurses, women who had spent months treating the wounded, the dying, the forgotten, looked up to see something that should have been impossible. A British military convoy had stopped outside their crumbling building. Soldiers, battle-hardened men who had fought across Burma and the Pacific, stepped out of their vehicles. And what happened next would break every protocol, challenge every prejudice, and prove that even in humanity's darkest hour, grace can pierce through hatred like light through a broken window. Before we dive into this extraordinary true story, drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from, and if you've ever witnessed a moment that completely changed your perspective on an enemy or a stranger. Because what these soldiers did wasn't just an act of kindness, it was an act of revolution. Now let me set the stage for why this moment matters more than any military victory, any political treaty, any official ceremony could ever capture. The summer of 1945 marked not just the end of World War II, but the beginning of one of history's most complex moral reckonings. Japan had surrendered. The atomic bombs had fallen on Hiroshima and Nagasaki just days before. Cities were in ruins. Millions were dead. And in the midst of this apocalyptic landscape, hatred ran deeper than the craters left by bombs. Allied soldiers had been taught for years to see the Japanese as the enemy, not just soldiers, but the embodiment of cruelty, the perpetrators of atrocities, the faces of a regime that had brought unspeakable suffering across Asia and the Pacific. And the Japanese? They had been told that surrender meant dishonor worse than death, that the Allied forces would show no mercy, that their culture, their people, their very existence would be erased. In this cauldron of fear, rage, and exhaustion, something unprecedented was about to unfold, a story that military historians would later struggle to document because it didn't fit the narrative. A moment that would be whispered about in letters home, remembered in tearful testimonies decades later, and yet somehow remain hidden from the grand chronicles of war. This is not just a story about soldiers and nurses. It's a story about the moment when humanity remembered itself. Let me introduce you to Captain James Morrison, a 34-year-old commanding officer of a British medical support unit. Morrison wasn't your typical military leader. Before the war, he had been a country doctor in a small village in Yorkshire, known for treating everyone from wealthy landowners to penniless farmers with the same gentle care and respect. He had joined the military not out of hatred for any enemy, but from a quiet, unshakable conviction that healers were needed wherever suffering existed. His unit had seen action across Southeast Asia, Burma, Singapore, Thailand, and Morrison had witnessed horrors that would have broken lesser men. Mass graves, prisoner camps, villages burned to ash. He had every reason to be bitter, to be hardened, to see the Japanese as monsters. But James Morrison carried something else with him, something that his men both admired and found deeply unsettling. He carried a worn leather journal and, in it, he wrote the names of every person he couldn't save. British, Japanese, civilian, soldier. It didn't matter. He believed, with a fervor that seemed almost naive in the context of war, that every life was a universe unto itself, deserving of dignity even in death. His men called him the Padre behind his back, not because he was overtly religious, but because he had this way of making even the most cynical soldier pause and reconsider the reflexive cruelty that war breeds. On August 12th, 1945, Morrison's convoy was moving through the outskirts of what remained of Hiroshima, tasked with surveying medical needs and establishing aid stations. The order from command was clear: assess, report, maintain distance from local populations, avoid fraternization. The war might be over, but the wounds, physical and emotional, were raw and dangerous. As they rounded a corner on a dusty road, past skeletal remains of buildings and desperate civilians searching through rubble, Morrison spotted something that made him raise his hand to halt the convoy. A building, once perhaps a school or administrative office, now transformed into a crude field hospital. Its walls were cracked, windows blown out, roof partially collapsed. But what caught Morrison's attention was the activity, the unmistakable signs of organized medical care happening inside. And standing outside, taking a brief moment in the harsh sunlight, were 7 Japanese nurses. They were young women, most in their early 20s, wearing white uniforms that had long ago lost their pristine nature, stained with blood, dirt, and the evidence of months without proper supplies. Their faces showed exhaustion that went beyond physical tiredness. This was the exhaustion of witnessing endless death, of working with inadequate tools to heal wounds too severe, of holding the hands of dying patients and whispering comfort even as bombs fell and the world burned. Morrison ordered his driver to stop. He stepped out of the vehicle and immediately felt the tension ripple through his unit. Several soldiers stiffened, hands instinctively moving closer to their weapons. Sergeant William Fletcher, Morrison's second-in-command, and a man who had lost his brother to Japanese forces in Singapore, spoke up with barely controlled anger. "Sir, with respect, we have our orders. We're not to engage with enemy medical facilities. We assess from distance and move on." Morrison looked at Fletcher, then back at the nurses, who had now frozen in place, their eyes wide with fear. In that moment, the weight of recent history hung in the air like smoke. These women had heard the stories too. Stories of what victorious armies do to the defeated, especially to women. Stories of retaliation, of punishment for a nation's sins. "Sergeant," Morrison said quietly, "those women have been doing the same work we have. Look at them. They're not soldiers. They're healers. They're Japanese," spat Private Thomas Henley, a young man barely 21 who had survived the Burma campaign and carried scars both visible and invisible. "They're the enemy. My mates died because of them. Why should we show them anything but the contempt they deserve?" Other soldiers murmured agreement. The atmosphere was electric with anger, with the desire for some form of retribution, even if it was just the cold shoulder of refusal to acknowledge the humanity of those who had been painted as less than human for so many years. But Morrison did something that defied not just military protocol, but the entire emotional architecture of war. He walked forward, directly toward the nurses. His men tensed. The nurses drew back, clustering together, their faces showing terror. Morrison stopped about 10 feet away. And then, slowly, deliberately, he removed his cap and held it over his heart. The silence that followed was suffocating. Every eye, British soldiers, Japanese nurses, even civilians who had emerged from the ruined building to see what was happening, fixed on this British officer standing bareheaded in the dust and rubble of defeated Japan. "You've been caring for the wounded," Morrison said in English, knowing they likely didn't understand his words, but hoping his tone would convey his meaning. "I'm a doctor. We're medical support. I want to know, do you need help?" One of the nurses, a young woman with hair pulled back severely from a face that showed signs of malnutrition and sleepless nights, stepped forward slightly. Her name tag, Morrison would later learn, identified her as Nurse Yuki Tanaka. She spoke in halting, careful English. Words she had learned in school before the war made such education seem like treason. "We need everything," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Medicine, bandages, food. We have 200 patients. Many are children. Many will die." Her voice cracked on the last word. "But we are enemy. You do not have to—" "Stop," Morrison interrupted gently. "Just stop right there." Behind him, Sergeant. Fletcher's voice rose, sharp and angry. "Captain Morrison, sir, this is completely inappropriate. These people, their military committed atrocities. We have documentation of what they did to our POWs, to civilians. We have orders not to fraternize. You're putting this entire unit at risk of disciplinary action. And for what? To help people who wouldn't have shown us the same mercy?" Morrison turned to face his men. And in that moment, something shifted in his demeanor. The gentle country doctor transformed into something else. A man who had seen too much death to tolerate one more preventable tragedy. A leader who understood that courage sometimes meant standing against your own side. "Sergeant Fletcher," he said, his voice carrying across the dusty courtyard with unexpected force, "what do you think mercy looks like? Do you think it's easy? Do you think it feels good? Do you think it's something we only extend to people who look like us, who fought on our side, who share our flag?" He paused, letting the questions hang in the air. "I've carried the bodies of our boys out of the jungle. I've stitched wounds inflicted by Japanese bullets. I've held dying men who called for their mothers with their last breath. So don't presume to tell me that I don't understand what we've lost or who we've been fighting." The conviction in his voice silenced even the most hostile murmuring among the soldiers. Morrison continued, softer now, but no less intense. "But I've also taken an oath. Before, I was a soldier, I was a healer, and my oath doesn't have a nationality clause. It doesn't say first, do no harm, except to your enemies. These women are nurses. They've taken the same oath. Look at their hands. Look at their uniforms. That's not the blood of soldiers they killed. That's the blood of patients they tried to save." Private Henley stepped forward, his face flushed with emotion. My brother died in Burma, sir. He was captured by the Japanese. They tortured him. They starved him. And you want us to just forget that? You want us to smile and shake hands and pretend that compassion erases what they did? Morrison's expression softened. He walked over to Henley, placed a hand on the young man's shoulder. When he spoke, his voice was thick with shared grief. I don't want you to forget, Thomas. I would never ask that. Your brother's death matters. Every single loss matters. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. But if we let hatred define our actions now, if we become the cruelty we fought against, then what did they die for? What do we become? The tension in the air was palpable. The crowd of observers, civilians who had gathered, the nurses standing frozen in fear and confusion, the British soldiers caught between ingrained hatred and the uncomfortable pull of their commander's moral clarity, all waited to see how this standoff would resolve. Nurse Tanaka spoke again, her voice stronger now, desperation overcoming fear. Please, I do not ask for forgiveness. For my country, I do not ask for myself. But inside, she gestured to the ruined hospital behind her, there are children, sick, burned, dying. Some are orphans, some are injured from the bomb. She choked on the word. They are innocent. They did not choose this war. They only suffer from it. Another nurse, older, perhaps in her early 30s, stepped forward and bowed deeply. When she straightened, tears were streaming down her face. She spoke in Japanese, and Nurse Tanaka translated haltingly. She says she is Nurse Keiko Yamamoto. Her husband was a soldier. He died in the Philippines. She has no love for war. She has no love for any military. But she has love for her patients. She begs that you understand. We are not political. We are not soldiers. We are only trying to keep people alive. Sergeant Fletcher, his jaw tight, his eyes hard, walked up to stand beside Morrison. The two men stood face to face, and for a moment it seemed as if the sergeant might actually challenge his commanding officer's authority. Instead, Fletcher spoke in a low voice, meant only for Morrison's ears, but audible to those standing close. Sir, I respect you. God knows I do. But this feels like a betrayal of everything we fought for. How do I look at myself in the mirror and say I helped the people who killed my friends? Morrison met his gaze steadily. William, he said, using the sergeant's first name, a rarity that signaled the depth of the moment. Helping these nurses isn't a betrayal of our fallen. It's a fulfillment of what they believed they were fighting for. A world where cruelty doesn't have the final word. Where children don't die because adults couldn't put aside hatred long enough to act like human beings. He turned back to Nurse Tanaka, then addressed all the nurses directly. How many nurses do you have working here? 7, Tanaka replied. 3 others died in the bombing. 1 went missing. We are all that remain. Morrison nodded. Slowly. Then he made a decision that would ripple far beyond that dusty courtyard, beyond that specific moment in time. He turned to his men, raised his voice to address the entire unit. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to offload medical supplies, antibiotics, bandages, morphine, whatever we can spare without compromising our primary mission. We're going to assess their facility and provide a report on what additional support is needed. And we're going to do it efficiently, professionally, and with the same care we'd show any medical facility in need. The protests erupted immediately. Voices overlapped, angry, confused, betrayed. But Morrison raised his hand, and gradually the noise subsided. I know what I'm asking is hard. Some of you think it's wrong, and I'm not ordering you to forget what this war cost us. But I am ordering you to remember what we're supposed to be. We're not conquerors seeking revenge. We're British soldiers. We have standards. We have honor. And damn it, we have compassion, even when, especially when, it's difficult. The silence that followed was different now. Not the electric tension of confrontation, but the heavy quiet of men grappling with something that challenged everything they thought they knew about victory, about justice, about the simple moral clarity that war had provided. Then something extraordinary happened. Corporal David Chen, a British soldier of Chinese descent who had his own complicated history with Japanese occupation, stepped forward. He'd been silent throughout the confrontation, but now he spoke, his voice carrying the weight of lived experience. Captain Morrison is right, Chen said simply. I have every reason to hate. My grandparents fled Nanking. I know what Japanese military did to Chinese civilians. But these women here? He gestured to the nurses. They're not the ones who did those things. And if we can't tell the difference between the guilty and the innocent, between soldiers and Healers. Then we're no better than the worst of what we fought against. His words seemed to break something open. Gradually, reluctantly, soldiers began to nod. Not with enthusiasm, not with joy, but with a grudging acceptance that perhaps their captain was asking them to be better than their basest instincts. Morrison turned back to the nurses. May we enter? May we see your facility and your patients? Nurse Tanaka looked at her colleagues, then back at Morrison. With visible trepidation, she nodded. Yes, please, follow. What the British soldiers found inside that makeshift hospital would haunt them for the rest of their lives, not with horror, but with a profound sense of shared humanity that war had tried so desperately to destroy. The building's interior was a testament to desperate improvisation. Beds were made from scavenged wood and torn fabric. Medical instruments had been sterilized and reused so many times they were barely functional. The smell of infection, of unwashed bodies, of death held at bay by sheer determination, filled the air. But more than the conditions, what struck the soldiers was the care. Despite having almost nothing, despite facing their own exhaustion and trauma, these nurses moved through the rows of patients with gentle efficiency. They checked pulses, changed bandages made from torn sheets, offered water and quiet comfort. And the patients, children with radiation burns, elderly civilians with crushing injuries, young women and men barely clinging to life, looked up at their caregivers with an expression Morrison recognized instantly. It was the same expression he'd seen in British field hospitals, in makeshift clinics across Southeast Asia. It was hope. It was gratitude. It was the universal human response to being cared for when death seems inevitable. Private Henley, the young soldier who had so vehemently protested helping the enemy, stopped beside a bed where a young boy, perhaps 7 years old, lay with severe burns covering his arms and face. The child's eyes were closed, his breathing shallow. Nurse Yamamoto was carefully applying some kind of salve to the burns. Morrison recognized it as a traditional herbal mixture, nowhere near as effective as the antibiotics and burn treatment they had in their supplies, but applied with such care, such precision, that the intent was unmistakable. Henley knelt beside the bed. His hands, which had so recently clenched into fists of anger, now trembled slightly. He reached out, not touching the boy, but placing his hand near the child's uninjured hand, as if offering proximity, presence. How old? He asked softly. Nurse Yamamoto looked up, surprised to be addressed directly. Through Tanaka's translation, she answered. 7 years. His name is Hiroshi. His mother brought him 3 days ago, then disappeared. We think she went looking for food and never returned. He asks for her when the pain medicine allows him to speak. Henley's face crumpled. Morrison, watching from across the room, saw the young soldier's entire emotional fortress collapse in that moment. Here was someone else's little brother, someone else's son, dying alone and in pain, cared for only by these exhausted women who had nothing to give but their presence and their determination. What does he need? Henley asked, his voice rough. Everything, Yamamoto replied simply. Antibiotics for infection, real burn treatment, food, clean water, pain medicine, a miracle. Henley stood abruptly, walked directly to the supplies his unit had brought, and began pulling out medical supplies, carefully organized kits that had been meant for their own wounded, their own facilities. He carried them back to Nurse Yamamoto and set them down beside young Hiroshi's bed. Show me how to help, he said. And that was the moment. That was when the dam truly broke. One by one, the British soldiers who had entered this hospital with hard hearts and clenched jaws found themselves unable to maintain the emotional distance that military training and wartime propaganda had instilled. They saw not enemies, but patients, not Japanese, but humans, not abstractions of the other, but individuals with names, with stories, with the same fundamental desire to live and be cared for that transcended nationality, politics, or history. Sergeant Fletcher approached Morrison, his expression complicated. Sir, the men they're helping. Distributing supplies, assisting with patient care. It's happening organically. I don't know if this is within our orders, but it's within our humanity, Morrison replied quietly. And that's the only order that truly matters right now. For the next several hours, an extraordinary collaboration unfolded. British soldiers and Japanese nurses worked side by side, communicating through gestures, through universal medical terminology, through the shared language of compassion. They treated burns, set bones, administered antibiotics, provided clean water and food from military rations. The nurses showed the soldiers traditional techniques for treating radiation sickness symptoms, knowledge born from desperate necessity after the atomic bombings. The soldiers shared modern medical supplies and techniques that could dramatically improve patient outcomes. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the broken windows of the hospital, Morrison found himself standing in the courtyard again, this time with Nurse Tanaka beside him. They had been working for hours, and both were exhausted, but there was something else in the air now. Something like cautious hope, like the first breath after a long time underwater. "Captain Morrison," Tanaka said carefully, "I must ask, why? Why do you help us? Your government, your people, they must hate us. We were enemies. Some of your soldiers, they still look at us with anger in their eyes. Why do you defy them?" Morrison was silent for a long moment, choosing his words carefully. "Before the war, I was a doctor in a small village. We had a saying, the body doesn't ask permission to bleed. Meaning, suffering doesn't care about politics or nationality. It just is. And healers, true healers, we respond to suffering wherever we find it." He paused. "But there's something else. Something I haven't told anyone, not even my men." Tanaka looked at him with curiosity and a hint of apprehension. "In 1942, I was captured by Japanese forces during the fall of Singapore. I was held for 3 weeks before I managed to escape." He saw Tanaka's face pale, clearly expecting him to recount horrors. "During that time, I was treated by a Japanese military doctor. He was an older man, probably in his 60s. He had no reason to care whether a British POW lived or died. In fact, he was reprimanded by his superior officer for wasting medical supplies on the enemy." Morrison's voice became thick with emotion. "But this doctor, I never learned his name. He treated my wounds. He gave me his own food ration twice. And, when he knew I was planning to escape, he left the door to the medical tent unlocked and turned away when I slipped out. I don't know if he faced punishment for that. I don't know if he survived the war. But he saved my life. Not because of orders, not because of military necessity, but because he chose compassion over hatred." Tears were streaming down Tanaka's face now. "That man," she whispered, "that could have been my father. He was a doctor, military medical corps. He was 63 when he was sent to Singapore. He never came home. We received word that he died in 1943, but we never learned how or where." The silence that followed was profound. Morrison and Tanaka stared at each other, the weight of an impossible coincidence, or perhaps fate, settling over them. "His name?" Morrison asked, his voice barely audible. "Dr. Kenji Tanaka. He believed—" Her voice broke. "He believed that a doctor's oath transcended war. He wrote to me once, saying that he had treated British prisoners, and that he hoped someone, somewhere, might show the same mercy to Japanese wounded. He was disciplined for it, but he never stopped." Morrison's hand moved to his pocket, where he pulled out the worn leather journal he always carried. He opened it to a specific page where, among the names of those he couldn't save, he had written, "Dr. T. Japanese military physician. Singapore, 1942. Saved my life. Died 1943. May his compassion be remembered." He showed the page to Tanaka. Her knees buckled and Morrison caught her, helping her to sit on a broken section of wall. She sobbed openly now, not just with grief for her father, but with the overwhelming realization that his act of mercy had rippled forward through time. That his choice to see humanity in an enemy had, in this moment 3 years later, created a chain of compassion that was saving lives in this ruined hospital. The British soldiers who had been watching this exchange didn't understand the words, but they understood the emotion. They saw their commander, the man they called the Padre, embracing this Japanese nurse as she wept. They saw the journal, though they couldn't read its contents. And something in them, something hard and angry and righteous, began to soften. As twilight deepened, Morrison made another decision, one that would be even more controversial than his initial choice to stop at the hospital. He called his men together in the courtyard, where the nurses had also gathered, exhausted from the day's work. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying the weight of what he was about to say. "What we've done today may result in disciplinary action when we report back to command. I want you to know that I take full responsibility. If there are consequences, they will fall on me, not on you.